The snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping, when Mara Voss finally admitted to herself that she was not lonely. She was sitting cross-legged on the worn wooden floor of her grandfather's cabin, a mug of chamomile tea cooling beside her knee, a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of in the past 40 minutes, and the wind outside was doing that thing it always did in deep winter, that low, sustained moan that traveled through the pine forest like something alive, like something searching. She was not lonely. She had decided this 2 years ago, when she packed 2 suitcases and a box of her grandfather's books, and drove north until the roads became suggestions, and the suggestions became tire tracks, and the tire tracks became her own. She had decided it firmly, the way you decide things you need to be true in order to keep moving, and most days it held. Most days the silence felt like a gift she had given herself, a deliberate and hard-won peace. And she would walk the tree line at dusk and watch the way the last light turned the snow to something almost blue, and she would feel, if not happy, then at least whole. Tonight, however, the wind was particularly insistent, and the cabin felt smaller than usual, and the book in her lap was a novel about 2 people falling in love in a city she had never visited. And Mara closed it, set it aside, and stared at the fire for a long time without thinking about anything at all. She heard it just past midnight. Not the wind, which she had catalogued in all its variations over 2 winters, but something underneath the wind, something with a different texture, closer to the ground, a sound that stopped and then came again, irregular, effortful. She set down her tea, which had gone completely cold, and listened with the particular quality of attention that living alone in a forest teaches you. That full-body stillness that is not fear but is adjacent to it, that readiness that keeps the heart rate slightly elevated until the sound resolves into something known. It did not resolve into something known. She pulled on her coat over her sweater without fully buttoning it, stepped into her boots without tying the laces, and opened the cabin door. The cold came in like a wall. The temperature had dropped sharply through the evening, and the air had that particular quality of deep northern cold, that dry, crystalline bite that goes straight to the back of the throat and makes the lungs work harder, that clarity that feels almost aggressive in its purity. Mara stood in the doorway with the warm orange light of the cabin spilling out behind her, and looked into the dark and the white and the dark between the white of the tree line. And for a moment she saw nothing. Then the shape on her porch resolved out of the snow. The wolf was enormous. She understood in the first second of seeing it that she had never actually understood the word enormous before, that she had applied it casually to things that were merely large, because this animal, this creature lying collapsed and half-curled at the edge of her porch, 3 feet from where she stood, redefined the term in a way that made everything she had previously called enormous seem modest and polite. It was white, almost entirely, the kind of white that is not a color so much as an absence of color, the white of new snow and old bone, and it was bleeding from a wound on its left flank that had stained the wood of the porch and a wide circle of snow around it in a deep, alarming red. Its eyes were closed. Its breathing was visible even through the snow, the slow, labored rise and fall of a chest that was working very hard to keep working. Mara stood in her doorway for 31 seconds. She counted them, later, when she was trying to reconstruct the logic of what she had done next. She stood there and looked at the wolf, and the wolf did not move. And she thought about the rifle her grandfather had kept above the fireplace. And she thought about the phone. She would not get signal on even if she called. And she thought about the 2 winters she had spent in this forest, and the wolves she had heard but never seen, and the stories her grandfather had told her about the old pack territories and the old agreements between the people of this place and the things that lived alongside them. And then she stopped thinking, and went inside, and got the first aid kit and a stack of old towels, and came back out and knelt down in the snow next to the wolf and started trying to save its life. She would not, in the days that followed, be able to fully explain this decision to herself in rational terms. The wolf was unconscious, and therefore not immediately threatening. But it was also an apex predator twice her body weight, and she was alone in a snowstorm with no way to call for help if things went wrong. The sensible thing, she knew, was to leave it. The sensible thing was to go back inside and let the forest manage its own, and in the morning either the wolf would be gone or it would not, and either way it would not be her problem. Mara had been sensible for most of her 23 years, and it had not made her happy, and it had not made her safe, and it had not prevented any of the losses that had accumulated in her life, like snow accumulates, quietly and without asking permission. And so she knelt in the freezing cold with her coat half-buttoned and her boots unlaced, and she pressed a towel against the wound on the wolf's flank, and she held it there with both hands, and she said, out loud, to no one, and to the wolf, and to the snowing dark, Okay, I've got you. If you've ever made a decision that changed everything and only understood its magnitude much later, if you've ever reached toward something without fully knowing why and found that the reaching itself was the most important thing you would ever do, then you already understand something about Mara Voss that she would not understand about herself for a very long time. And if this story is already doing something to you, if you're already leaning forward a little, already wanting to know, then stay with us. Because this is only the beginning, and I promise you the beginning is the least of it. The wound was deep but clean, as if made by something very sharp rather than another animal's teeth or claws. Mara had some rudimentary knowledge of first aid, the kind you accumulate when you choose to live far from emergency services, and she worked in the cold for the better part of an hour, cleaning the wound with the supplies from her kit, pressing clean cloths against it until the bleeding slowed, wrapping what she could with the medical bandaging she kept for her own potential emergencies. The wolf did not stir throughout this process. Its breathing remained slow and labored but consistent, and its warmth was extraordinary, a radiant animal heat that surprised her even through her gloves, as if something inside it burned hotter than it should. When she had done everything she could do on the porch, she sat back on her heels and looked at it and thought about what came next. She could not carry it inside. She had assessed this early and accepted it. The animal weighed more than she did, and it was dead weight, and she was alone. But she could not leave it outside either, not with the temperature still dropping and the wound still fresh. She solved this the way she solved most problems in her life, which was by being more stubborn than the problem. She found the heavy canvas tarp she used to cover her woodpile, laid it out beside the wolf, and spent the next 30 minutes easing and rolling and maneuvering the animal onto it, with a patience and determination that left her sweating inside her coat, despite the cold. Then she dragged the tarp to the doorway, got it inside by inches, and maneuvered it as close to the fire as she reasonably dared. She got more blankets. She got more water. She sat down on the floor beside the unconscious wolf and looked at it in the firelight and thought, I have made a decision whose consequences I cannot predict. Then she thought, that has always been true of every decision that mattered. Then she stopped thinking and watched the fire, and eventually fell asleep, sitting up with her back against the couch, and her hands still faintly red from the cold. She woke to eyes. They were open when she startled awake in the early gray morning. Those eyes, and they were watching her with an attention so focused, and so complete and so utterly unlike what she had expected from an injured and confused wild animal, that her breath caught in her throat and she went very still. The eyes were pale, not yellow, the way she might have expected, and not the amber gold of the wolves in photographs, but a pale silver gray so light it was almost white, the color of the sky just before dawn in deep winter, and they were watching her with something she could only describe, despite every sensible objection she had to the word, as recognition. Not the recognition of a predator recognizing prey, not the recognition of a startled wild animal recognizing an unfamiliar human and calculating threat. Something else, something quieter and more impossible. The recognition of one consciousness encountering another and registering without confusion that it has been seen. You're awake, Mara said, because she was someone who talked when she was nervous, and she was, very suddenly, nervous. That's good. That's a good sign. She stayed very still, her hands open in her lap, nothing threatening in her posture, the way she had read somewhere that you were supposed to approach unknown animals. I'm not going to hurt you. I know you have no reason to believe that, but I'm saying it anyway. You were hurt, and I brought you inside, and now you're by the fire, and I'm going to try to leave you alone and let you heal." She paused. The wolf's gaze did not waver. "I don't know what happened to you," she said, more quietly. "But whatever it was, it looks like it was bad. So, you're safe here. As much as anywhere is safe." The wolf looked at her for a long moment that stretched in the firelight morning silence. Then it lowered its enormous head back onto its forepaws and closed its eyes. Not with the abruptness of an animal losing consciousness, but with the deliberate, careful quality of an exhausted person allowing themselves to rest. Because something has been resolved. Mara sat with her arms around her knees and her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and outside the snow was still falling, and the world was still white and still, and she thought, well, there it is then. It stayed. This was not entirely surprising, given that it was injured and the winter was brutal and her cabin was warm, but it stayed in a way that was not purely practical, in a way that she found difficult to categorize and eventually stopped trying. 2. Within 3 days, it could stand. Unsteadily at first, and then with more confidence. And she moved the tarp and blankets to the corner of the main room near the window, and it used them as a bed, which she found both strange and charming. It ate what she gave it, which she expected would be raw meat only, and discovered was more flexible than that, and she made a mental note to read more about wolf physiology, and then made the more practical note to drive into the nearest town for better provisions when the roads cleared enough to allow it. It did not crowd her. It did not ask for her attention, but when she was in the room, it watched her, and when she moved, its gaze tracked her, and when she sat down to read or to work at her laptop or to eat her meals, it arranged itself in relation to her with the quiet, undemonstrative attention of something that had decided she was its primary point of orientation in the world. She named it, eventually, because she needed something to call it. That was not the wolf, which felt both too general and too pointed. She called it Ash because of the color of those pale eyes, because of something in its quality of stillness that reminded her of the way ash sits in a cold fireplace, present and patient, and containing within its pale quiet the memory of a much greater heat. Ash, she said, the first time she used it out loud, testing it, and the wolf looked at her with those silver-gray eyes, and she felt something move in her chest. That was either recognition or the beginning of a feeling she did not have a name for yet. "Okay," she said. "Ash, tell me something. If you're watching this, have you ever had the experience of becoming known to someone in the wrong order? Of pouring yourself out into a space and only afterward realizing that the space was occupied? That is something of what is coming for Mara, but she doesn't know it yet. She's just a woman in a cabin in the snow, talking to a wolf, and for the first time in 2 years she does not feel lonely at all, and she will not let herself think too hard about what that means. She talked to it constantly. This was, she told herself, simply a matter of practicality, of maintaining the kind of vocal presence that would keep the animal comfortable with her movements and accustomed to her existence in its space. She had read about this, about the importance of voice in building trust with wild animals, about how silence could read as tension and speech could communicate calm. This was the reason. This was the entirely sensible and well-researched reason. It had nothing to do with the 2 years of silence and the letters she had stopped writing and the phone calls she had learned to shorten, and the way loneliness had settled into her bones so gradually that she had almost stopped being able to distinguish it from her own skeleton. She told it about the book she was reading. Not summaries, but real engagement, the kind she had previously only had in her head because there was no one to have it with out loud. She told it about her grandfather, about the way he had moved through the world with a quality she could only call largeness, not physical size, but a largeness of presence and attention and care, the way he had made every person who spoke to him feel as if they were the only thing in the world that mattered at that moment, and about how losing him had been like losing a way of understanding what she was for. She told it about the years before she came here, the job she had been good at and had not loved, the relationship that had ended not with any single dramatic rupture, but with the slow, painful realization that she had been making herself smaller for so long that she had genuinely lost track of what her actual size was. She told it about the drive north, about stopping at a gas station somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the dark of a November night, and sitting in her car for 20 minutes, listening to a song she had never heard before on the radio, and crying in a way that felt, paradoxically, like relief. Ash listened. This was the word for it, even though she knew, or thought she knew, that listening was not precisely what an animal was capable of, but it was not simply the passive presence of an animal being near her while she spoke. It was attentive. It was oriented. When she said something particularly important, something she had not said out loud before, and that she could feel the weight of as it left. Her mouth, its gaze would sharpen in a way she noticed but could not explain, and sometimes it would lift its head and look at her directly, and the quality of that gaze would make her feel, in the most unsettling and inexplicable and somehow wonderful way, that she had been genuinely heard. "I think I came here to disappear," she told it one night in early February, sitting on the floor with her back against the couch and her tea growing cold in her hands, the fire low and the room full of soft, orange shadows. "I think I thought if I went somewhere nobody was looking for me, then I could figure out who I was when nobody was looking. And I have figured some of it out, I think. But I also think I might have gotten a little too good at being invisible, like I forgot how to be seen." She looked at the wolf, at those pale eyes steady on her face. "Does that make sense?" A pause. "You always look at me like it makes sense." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment. Then it did, something it had never done before. It got up from its corner, crossed the room slowly, and lay down beside her on the floor, close enough that its flank was warm against her leg, and it put its head on its forepaws and looked at the fire. Mara sat very still with her heart doing that complicated thing again, and after a while she put her hand, carefully, on the wolf's back, and it did not move away, and she sat there with the firelight on her face, and her hand on the warm, breathing creature. Beside her, and something in her that had been very tightly held for a very long time, quietly began to let go. "Now stop. Pause here with me for just a moment, because I need you to understand something before we go further. What is happening in this cabin is not a small thing, even though it looks small, even though it looks like a lonely woman finding comfort in an injured animal in the middle of a long winter. What is happening here is that a sealed door is being opened. Not violently, not all, at once, but in the way that real openings happen, slowly and almost without notice, breath by breath and word by word, and the warmth of one body near another. What is happening is that two beings who have both been very alone are recognizing each other across a distance that should be uncrossable. And if you feel something right now, if this quiet moment in the firelight is doing something to you, please tell me in the comments what it is, because I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Even if you've never been in a snowed-in cabin with a white wolf, I think you know. His name was not Ash. His name was Kalen Ashville, and he was old in a way that the word old does not adequately contain, old in the way that certain mountains are old, not in years counted, but in the quality of having preceded nearly everything else, and having watched it all come and go. He was the first of his kind, the original, the one from whom all the great bloodlines descended, and his power was of a different order than anything that had come after him, not greater by degree but different in kind, the way a source is different from what flows from it, the way a root is different from the branches. He had ruled the great pack territories for longer than the territories had had names, and he had governed not through fear, which was easy, but through something rarer and more difficult, through genuine authority, through the kind of power that comes from being the thing you are completely and without apology. And the packs had been, under his hand, not just strong but whole. The council had feared him for exactly this reason. 7 ancients, the oldest of the bloodlines, the self-appointed guardians of what they called the balance, which in practice meant the preservation of their own influence over the pack territories they administered in his absence. For decades they had worked against him in small ways, complicating alliances, managing information, arranging circumstances so that, The power they owed to his authority was slowly, imperceptibly, transferred to themselves, and when he had finally turned his full attention to what they were doing, when he had begun to understand the architecture of what they had built in the spaces of his inattention, they had moved to stop him the only way they could, not through strength, through treachery. The curse was old magic, the oldest kind, rooted in the primordial laws that governed even him. Laws older than his authority, older than his bloodline, older than language. They had prepared it for years, gathering the components across decades, and they had delivered it at a summit he had called specifically to address their corruption, which had been, he understood now, exactly what they had been waiting for. 7 voices, 7 bloodlines, one ancient working, and the world had contracted around him into a single, narrow, impossible thing. Animal form. Permanent. Complete. The wolf that was the source and shape of his nature. Frozen. Fixed. Every other part of him sealed away behind glass he could see through but not break. He could think. This was the part they had not fully considered, or perhaps they had considered it and found it acceptable. A particular cruelty. He could think with complete clarity, with every faculty of his ancient mind, and he could feel everything that a body feels, and he could understand every word spoken to him, and perceive every emotional nuance in the voice that spoke it, and he could do nothing with any of this except witness. The first year had been the worst. He did not think about the first year. The condition of the curse's breaking was what they had counted on as the real imprisonment. To be truly known, the working specified, with a precision he had come to appreciate as evidence of how carefully they had crafted it. To be truly known by a human heart, without magic, without coercion, without revelation, not loved, not desired, not pitied, known, the heart that knew him would need to understand what he was, not the king, not the ancient, but the particular and specific being underneath all of that. And that understanding would need to come without any knowledge of what it was doing, without any stake in the outcome, freely and without the weight of what it cost. The ancients had considered this impossible. They were not wrong that it was difficult. They were wrong, as arrogant things often are, in believing that what they found inconceivable could not happen. He had not intended to find her. He had been in the deep forest when the hunters from the Valdris territory, enforcers working on behalf of the council to ensure his continued imprisonment, had found him. He had been faster than them, even in this form, and he had run in the dark and the cold, and they had clipped him with something that should not have been possible. An iron-laced blade fired from a distance, ancient working invested in a modern form, and he had run until he couldn't run anymore, and had collapsed on the steps of a cabin where light still burned in the window despite the hour, and the cold, and the brutality of the storm, and the woman inside had come out, and had looked at him with those serious, winter-colored eyes, and had said, "I've got you," and had gotten down on her knees in the freezing dark, and started saving his life. He had been alive for a very long time. He had been the subject of quite a lot of human attention in that time, and he was not naive about what human care could be motivated by, and what it could conceal. He had watched her with the same careful attention he gave everything, watching for the performance, for the interest that wanted something in return, for the fear dressed as kindness. He did not find any of these things. What he found instead was something he had not expected and did not immediately know how to categorize. A person being entirely herself, fully and without edit, in the company of someone she believed could not judge her or report her or require anything of her. He watched her be lonely and refuse to admit it, and then admit it by degrees. He watched her be brilliant and treat this as ordinary. He watched her care for him with a matter-of-factness that was more moving than any grand gesture. The way she checked his wound each morning without fuss. The way she moved around him in the cabin with a natural accommodation of his presence, as if he simply belonged in her space, and this required no particular commentary. He watched her grieve her grandfather and laugh at her own jokes and make her tea and talk to the fire when she forgot he was listening, and then remember and look at him with that slightly embarrassed half-smile that meant she had let herself be more seen than she intended. He understood, somewhere in the long, cold weeks of February, that what he felt for her was not gratitude. Gratitude, he knew, had given and received across centuries, and it had a specific texture, a warmth at a slight distance, an appreciation contained within its own completeness. What he felt for Mara Voss was not contained within anything. It was open at every end. It was the specific ache of someone who knew exactly what they wanted and could not move toward it, and could not look away. She knew him. She did not know she knew him. She called him Ash, and talked to him about loneliness and books and grief, and the particular quality of snowlight in the hour before dawn, and in the process, without. Knowing what she was doing, she had seen him more clearly than most beings ever had in all his long existence. Not the king, not the power. Him. The particular texture of his attention. The way he oriented toward the things she said that were true, rather than the things she said that were safe. The way he stayed close to her in the evenings, not because he needed the warmth, but because he had decided, with a deliberateness that was entirely his own, that she was where he wanted to be. She had seen all of this and reflected it back to him without naming it, and without knowing how much it cost him to hold still while she did. The curse broke on a Tuesday in late February, in the late afternoon, when the light was doing that specific winter thing of being simultaneously golden and cold, the light that makes everything look significant. Mara had been reading out loud to him, something she had started doing in the past weeks, working through her grandfather's collection of old folklore and mythology, which she said she was reading for research, and which Kaylin suspected she was reading because the stories of ancient things made her feel less alone in the world, which made him feel something almost unbearable. She was reading a passage about a king who had been unmade by his own power and remade by the knowledge of another, and she had stopped and looked at him and said quietly, almost to herself, "I wonder if that's what it feels like to be really seen by someone. Like being unmade and remade, like finding out you're larger than you thought." And then she looked at him, and the thing in her eyes was not the careful affection she had been cultivating across these weeks, not the gentle warmth of a person tending something wounded, but something deeper and more direct and entirely without performance, a seeing that was complete and specific and full of everything she knew, which was more than she realized, which was, in fact, enough. The working that had held him for 100 years registered this with something that felt, even encoded in ancient magic, like surprise, and then it let go. The pain was extraordinary. He had expected it, had known for weeks that the condition was approaching completion, had felt the curse thinning at the edges the way ice thins at the end of winter, and he had still not been adequately prepared for the experience of being poured back into himself, of every sealed and silenced part of him, unlocking at once, form and voice and memory and authority all returning with a simultaneity that was almost overwhelming, even for someone with his capacity. He was on his feet before he was fully himself again. He was himself before he fully understood what was happening around him. And what was happening around him was that Mara Voss had dropped her book and was backed against the far wall of the cabin and was looking at him with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, terror and something else that he would have time to examine later, but that he registered even now, even in this overwhelming and disorienting moment of return, as important. Mara, his voice, after 100 years, was rougher than he remembered. Deeper. It filled the cabin differently than her voice had, with a resonance that was part of his nature, part of what he was, and he watched her register it, and watched the terror in her face not disappear, but reorient. "I need you to understand that you are not in danger." "What?" she said. Not a question. A word deployed while she worked out what to do next. "My name is Kaylin Ashvile. I was placed under a curse 100 years ago by a council of ancients who feared what I was. The curse took my form. I have been here, in this form, since the night you found me injured on your porch. I have been aware of everything. I have heard everything you said. I understand that this is..." He paused, searching for the word. "A great deal." The silence that followed this was of the kind that has its own weather, Mara stood against the wall and looked at him. At this large, impossibly present man standing in her cabin in the late afternoon light where her wolf had been. And he watched her process what he had told her with the particular quality of attention he had been watching for weeks, that absolute and unperforming intelligence she deployed when something was important, and she did not want to get it wrong. He watched her face move through terror and shock, and something raw, and starting, and then, predictably, inevitably, because she was who she was, to anger. "You heard everything," she said. "Yes." "For 2 months." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw did something that he had learned meant she was deciding how honest to be. "I told you things," she said, "that I have not told anyone. I know. And you couldn't tell me who you were. I could not speak. I could not transform. I had no way to communicate what I was. I understand how this looks. Understand what it cost you to trust something you believed could not betray you. And I understand that what you have just learned changes the nature of that trust in ways that are not comfortable. I am not asking you to feel anything other than what you feel. I am asking only that you let me explain." The look she gave him then was one he had not seen from her before, a measuring look with something underneath it that was hurt. And he found, to his own surprise, that the hurt in her eyes was harder to stand than any of the physical pain of the past 100 years. "Start explaining then," she said. "If you're feeling what I think you're feeling right now, that complicated mix of sympathy for Mara and something that wants to argue on Kaylin's behalf even though you understand exactly why she's angry, please go ahead and pause and leave me a comment about it, because the conversation in the comments is always one of my favorite parts of sharing these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, and you're here watching this, please do, because there is a great deal more of this story to come, and I think you're going to want to be here for it." He talked for a long time. This was something he had not done in a century, and it had the quality of water returning to a dry channel, at first tentative, and then increasingly certain, finding its own course. He told her about the council, and the territories, and the long years of governance, and the slow realization of what they had been doing, while his attention was elsewhere. He told her about the summit, and the working, and the specific and terrible experience of awareness without agency, of thinking and perceiving and feeling with complete clarity, while being unable to act on any of it. He told her about the condition of the breaking, and why he had not been able to reveal it to her, why any attempt to explain or manipulate the situation would have voided the only possible path to freedom. He told her about the hunters, and the blade and the storm and the porch and her face in the doorway with the cabin light behind her saying, "I've got you to something," she thought could not understand her. Mara listened the way she listened to everything, with her full attention, standing first and then sitting as the explanation extended, sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on him, not moving away but not softening either. A steadiness that was not acceptance, but was something equally important. The decision to hear what was being said, before deciding what to do with it. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. "The council," she said finally. "They're still out there." "Yes, and they will know by now that the curse has broken." The working had a notification component, a signal to the parties who cast it. "We have some time, but not a great deal of it." "How much time?" "Days. Perhaps less." She processed this. "And when they come, what happens?" "That depends on what?" "Resources I can reassemble and how quickly. My authority over the Pact territories does not disappear with the curse's end. But the Council has had 100 years to consolidate their position. I am not walking back into a simple situation." "No," she agreed. Then she looked at him with those eyes that he had been looking into for 2 months from the floor, and that looked entirely different from up here. From this angle, full of a directness that was almost physical in its quality. "You know, things about me that I've never told anyone." "Yes, that's not fair." "No, it isn't." Another long silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the late afternoon light was deepening toward evening, and the shadows among the trees were growing long and blue. Mara looked at her hands and then at him, and then at something in the middle distance that was not quite either of them. "Ash," she said quietly. as if trying the name in this new context. And something in his chest did what he supposed chests did, when they were not accustomed to feeling the particular thing they were currently feeling. "My name is Kaylin," he said. "I know what your name is," she said. "I'm deciding whether it fits." He looked at her. She looked back at him. And despite everything, despite the fear and the revelation and the complicated, terrible weight of what had just been revealed and what was coming, the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one, something wry and unwilling and entirely her, and Kaylin Ashvale, the primordial king, stood in a small cabin in the frozen north and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Felt it with a completeness that surprised him even now, even after everything. And the feeling was hope. The next morning, they made a plan. This was also very like Mara, he was discovering, in this new configuration of their relationship, where he could participate rather than merely observe. She processed difficult things overnight and emerged in the morning with a practical orientation that was its own form of courage. She made coffee, 2 cups, which she had not done before, and which she did now without commenting on. And she put one in front of him, and sat across the table and said, "Tell me what I need to know about the council." He told her. He told her about the 7 ancients, their names and their territories and their particular capacities and weaknesses, the specific shape of the working they had used, and what it implied about the resources they were willing to employ. He told her about the enforcer packs they maintained, the ones who had been tracking him in the forest, and about the diplomatic structures they had built over 100 years that would not simply collapse when his authority reasserted itself. He told her about the primordial laws that governed what he was, the rules older than any of them that the council had used against him, and that could also be used to hold them accountable. While he talked, she listened, and while she listened, she asked questions that were sharp and specific and that revealed consistently that she understood more about power structures and institutional corruption than her solitary life in the woods would have suggested. He filed this away for later, along with several other things about Mara Voss that he was collecting with the same careful attention he had given everything about her since the first night. "The primordial laws," she said. "You said they're older than your authority. Does that mean they're binding on the council as well?" "Yes. They bind all who share the nature regardless of position, and the curse they used. Was it a violation of those laws?" He looked at her. It was technically within the letter of the laws. The working required 7 bloodline voices and a condition of breaking. The condition they chose was intended to make breaking functionally impossible, but they were careful about the structure. They are very practiced at working within forms while subverting their intent. She made a sound that was half appreciation and half contempt. "I know that dynamic," she said. "I spent 3 years working in institutional management. The people who are best at corrupting systems are always the ones who understand the rules most thoroughly." She looked up. "Which means the way to use the rules against them is to be more thorough than they were. To find the thing they were too arrogant to think anyone would look for." "That is exactly right," Kaylin said. He was, despite everything, despite the urgency and the danger and the complex weight of all of it, having a very interesting morning. They came on the 3rd day. Mara had remained in the cabin, which had been the subject of their first real disagreement. She had argued that leaving was the sensible option, and Kaylin had argued that the cabin, positioned at the edge of the old Pack territories and on land that had been in her family for generations, sat within a boundary structure that had legal standing in primordial law, that it was defensible in ways that open territory was not, and that running would signal weakness to entities who understood the dynamics of pursuit. They had argued about this for 40 minutes, which was the longest conversation they had had, and which had the quality, Mara observed privately, of arguing with someone who respected your objection while remaining convinced of their own position, which was both frustrating and, she would not say this out loud, somewhat remarkable in her experience of arguments. She had made him explain the boundary law to her in detail. She had asked 17 questions. He had answered all of them without impatience, which she noticed. And by the end she had agreed that his position was correct. which she had also noticed herself noticing. These were both things to think about later, when there was a later. They came in the early morning, 3 of them initially, moving through the tree line with the particular quality of motion that told her, even without Kaylin's quiet commentary behind her, that they were not human. They were large, and they were fast, and they moved through the deep snow with an ease that bypassed physics in a way she found both impressive and alarming. And they stopped at the edge of the boundary she now understood as real, a line that had no visible marker, but that they clearly perceived. And the one at the center of the 3 shifted to human form and stood looking at the cabin with an expression she could see even at this distance. "That's Varen," Kaylin said from behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, that same extraordinary radiant heat he had in animal form, apparently just an attribute of what he was. He's the youngest of the 7, the most pragmatic, the one most likely to understand when the terms have changed, and the least likely to do something stupid out of pride. The least likely, yes, not entirely without risk. Mara looked at the man standing at the tree line. He was tall and pale, and he had the quality that Kaylin had, that presence that registered differently than ordinary physical size, a sense of depth behind the surface of things. He was looking at the cabin with the specific expression of someone who has prepared for one situation and arrived to find a different one. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Mara, you said the cabin is within the boundary. Structure. You said primordial law recognizes the standing of those within the boundary as parties to any negotiation in this location. You said they cannot enter without consent. All of that is true. Then I have standing. And you walking out there looks like the beginning of a confrontation. Me walking out there looks like something else." She turned and looked at him. "Let me be useful." Something crossed his face that was complicated and very fast. "You are not a piece in this. I know. I'm not. I'm asking to participate. There's a difference." The silence between them had the quality that their silences had been developing over the past days. A density, a charge, as if the air between them was paying closer attention than air usually did. Kaylin looked at her for a long moment with those silver-gray eyes that were the same color whether he was wolf or man, the single constant between the 2 forms that she had identified and was not currently thinking about. Then he said, "Stay in the boundary. Do not step outside the line. I know. If he moves in a way that I tell you is threat signaling, come inside immediately." "Understood." "Mara," his voice dropped in a way that did something to the air in the room and to her sternum simultaneously. "Be careful." She went outside into the cold, which was still the deep, bitter cold of late winter, but which had a different quality now. Less like a presence, and more like a context. The cold of a world that contained more things than she had recently understood it to contain. She walked to the middle of her porch and stood with her arms at her sides, and the man at the tree line looked at her with an expression that was reassessing its earlier position in real time. And she said, "Vareen." He was quiet for a moment. "You know my name. I know a number of things. I know that you've come because the working you participated in 100 years ago has ended. And I know that you're uncertain about what that means for your position. And I know that you're intelligent enough to have arrived here before the others, and to have come in a form that signals discussion rather than action. So, let's have one." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're human," he said. Not dismissively, but with genuine curiosity, as if the fact was an interesting complication he was working through. "Entirely," she confirmed. "And I have boundaries standing in this location, which you already know, and I have been conducting research over the past 3 days that you should probably hear before you decide how to proceed." She paused. "The primordial law regarding sealed workings, specifically the provision about the condition of release and its implications for the standing of the workings architects once the condition has been met." Something changed in Varen's face. It was subtle, barely a shift in the quality of his stillness. But she was someone who paid attention, and she caught it. "That provision is broadly interpreted," he said carefully. "It's broadly interpreted by parties with an interest in broad interpretation. The original language is quite specific. She had spent 2 days going through her grandfather's books. which were, she had discovered with a jolt of cold recognition, not simply old folklore collections, but something else, something specific and intentional, a scholar's archive of primordial law compiled by a man who had clearly known, on some level, what the forest his cabin sat in contained. Would you like to come to the porch and discuss it? You're welcome within the boundary. Another pause, longer this time. Then Varen shifted forward, crossing the invisible line with the careful deliberateness of someone making a clear choice to de-escalate, and Mara breathed out slowly through her nose and thought, Okay, we might have this. I want to stop here and say something to everyone who's been watching this unfold. Mara walked out alone onto that porch knowing what might be there and what might be at stake, and she did it because she had spent enough time being invisible, and she was not interested in being it anymore. If that hits you somewhere real, if you've been waiting for the moment when you stop making yourself small for situations that deserve more of you, please tell me in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe, because I don't want you to miss what comes next, and what comes next is the part that I think you're here for. The negotiation took 4 hours. Mara made tea, which she had the sense was an unexpected move that recalibrated the tone of the entire encounter. And she and Varen sat at her kitchen table with Kaelin standing near the window, and the other 2 enforcers waiting at the tree line, and they went through the primordial law provision by provision, clause by clause, with a precision that she had not known she was capable of until she found herself in a situation where precision was what stood between everything and catastrophe. Her grandfather's books were open between them. Varen, she discovered, was not what she had expected. He was genuinely intelligent, and he was genuinely conflicted, and he was, as Kaelin had said, pragmatic in a way that allowed him to update his position when the evidence warranted it. The legal case was not simple. She had not expected it to be. But it was real, and it was specifically rooted in provisions that the council's architects had almost certainly reviewed and believed they had accounted for, and the gap between what they had believed and what was actually there was exactly the kind of gap that opens up when intelligent people overestimate their own thoroughness. The condition of the breaking was the key. Once it had been met freely and without coercion, the working was retroactively classified as unlawful confinement under primordial law, which meant that every action taken on the basis of the imprisoned party's incapacity was subject to review. Every territory transfer, every authority the council had accumulated, every decision made in the vacuum of his absence, all of it, subject to review. Varen sat back in his chair when she finished laying this out and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "You've been preparing this for 3 days," he said. 2.5. He told you where to look. He told me the laws existed. I found the specific language myself. She paused. My grandfather left me a very thorough library. Something shifted in Varen's expression that was not quite a smile, but contained elements of one. The Voss scholar, he said, with a weight that told her this was a name he recognized, that her grandfather's library had not been an accident, and that there was a history here she did not yet fully understand. I wondered if the cabin would come into this. It has. And now the question is, what you want to do with that. She looked at him steadily. You came here first, and alone, which means something. You could have come with the full council and you didn't. I'd like to understand why. The silence that followed was of the kind that contains a decision being made. Varen looked at her, and then at Kaelin by the window, and then back at her, and something settled in his face. A resolution. A choosing of a side that was also a choosing of a kind of person to be. Because I voted against the working, he said. 100 years ago. I was outvoted and I complied, and I have been making peace with that. Compliance ever since. And when the signal came 2 nights ago, I thought, here it is. Here's the thing you have been waiting for. He looked at Kaelin. I am not your enemy. I know, Kaelin said. His voice was quiet. I have known for a long time. The other 6 did not accept the terms easily. This was expected, and it was managed, not through the direct confrontation that the council likely anticipated, but through the mechanism that Mara had identified in the primordial law, the review. process that required their presence before a binding of their own design, a structure they had used against Kaelin, and that was now the architecture of their own accounting. They arrived over the following days, 1 and 2 at a time, drawn by summons and by curiosity, and by the complex web of obligation that primordial law wove between all those who shared the nature. And each time they arrived, they found not the chaos they had perhaps expected, not a king raging back into his authority, but a table and a fire, and a woman with her grandfather's books open in front of her, who asked them to sit down and explained patiently and precisely what the law said. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and 2 of them required confrontations that Kaelin handled with a controlled and focused power that Mara witnessed at a careful distance, and that she filed away with all the other things she was collecting about what he was and what he was capable of. But it moved, and it had direction, and by the end of the 2nd week there was a framework, imperfect and provisional, but real, a structure of review and accountability that had primordial standing and that could not be simply overwritten by the council's subsequent preferences. Varen, it turned out, had been accumulating documentation of his own for decades, and the addition of his testimony and his records to the framework made it something qualitatively more solid than either of them could have built alone. On the last night before the formal review binding, Mara sat on the floor in front of the fire in the same place she had sat all winter, with the same cold tea and the same worn quilt and the same book she would probably not read. And Kaelin sat beside her, which had become a thing that happened now, an unceremonious and mutual arrangement that neither of them had explicitly named. The cabin was quiet, and the fire was low, and the snow outside had finally begun the quality of change that indicated approaching spring, a softness at the edges of the cold that was not yet warmth, but was the memory of warmth returning. "Your grandfather," Kaelin said. Not a question exactly. Mara looked at the fire. He knew about all of this, didn't he? He was the foremost human scholar of primordial law in the last century. He came to the territories as a young man and spent a season learning from the Pax and never entirely left, not in his attention, not in his scholarship. He built his library specifically to be useful to someone in exactly this situation. A pause. I knew him. Not well, but I knew him. Before the working, when I was still in possession of my own form, I met him at a gathering of scholars in the Eastern Territories. He was remarkable. Mara was quiet for a moment. He left me the cabin, she said. He left me all the books. He left me a note that said, "Go north and learn what you need to know." Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they are holding something that is not fully stable yet. I thought he meant about myself. Perhaps he meant both. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire with the quality of attention she had been watching for 2 months from a different angle. That deep and unhurried attention that had nothing to perform and nowhere to be. And she thought about what she had said in this room in the dark of February, to something she believed could not report on her, about being seen and about being made larger than you thought. And she thought about what it meant that he had heard all of it and was still here, not out of obligation and not out of debt, but because this was where he had decided to be. "You know things about me that I've never told anyone," she said, which was what she had said the night the curse broke. And he turned and looked at her and she said, "I'd like to know things about you." The thing that crossed his face then was something she had not seen there before, something open and careful at once, something that was aware of its own fragility and did not hide this. "That is going to take some time," he said. "I have been alive for a very long time." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The fire crackled. The snow outside was doing its late winter thing, that soft, particular settling that sounds almost like breathing. Kaelin looked at Mara with those pale eyes that were the same color in every form he took, and Mara looked back at him with the full direct attention that had, without her realizing what she was doing, changed everything. And between them, the air had that quality. It had been developing for weeks, that density, that charge. And he reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the quilt, and she turned her hand over and held it. And neither of them said anything at all, and the fire burned, and the snow fell, and the world was very quiet, and everything that needed to be said had already been said, in the long, patient language of a winter's worth of being known. I know. Take a moment, and if you need to leave a comment to process this, please do, because I'm in this with you. 3 years later, the Pact territories looked different from the inside than they had in the 100 years of the Council's administration, which was not to say they were perfect, because they were not, because nothing in the long project of genuine governance is ever simply perfect, but they had the quality of things that are moving in a direction, rather than simply holding a position. The review process had taken 14 months in total, a complicated and sometimes contentious unwinding of 100 years of accumulated misdirection. And what emerged from it was not a restoration of the old structure, but something that had learned from the failure of the old structure, a distributed council that balanced PAC representation with binding law, with accountability mechanisms that had primordial standing and could not be overwritten by any single authority, including Kalen's own. This had been his insistence, and it had surprised people, which had surprised him, that the thing they found most difficult to believe was that the person with the most power was the one most committed to limiting it in the right ways. Mara had a role in the new structure that she had not sought, and that she had accepted for reasons that had as much to do with her grandfather's memory as with anything else, the position of human scholar and legal interpreter, which had never previously existed, and which existed now because the primordial law had always made provision for human standing within the territories, and the council had always suppressed this provision, and she had found it in a library and refused to let it go. She worked from the cabin still, mostly with trips to the Pact territories for formal sessions, and her grandfather's books had been joined by several more crates that had arrived from various archives once the word had gone out that the Voss scholarship was being continued by a Voss who was continuing it very actively and with excellent legal results. The cabin was larger now. Not structurally, it was the same 4 walls and the same creaking porch and the same window that looked out into the same tree line, but it was larger in the way that spaces become larger when they are shared by people who make room for each other, rather than simply coexisting in a defined allocation of square footage. There were 2 desks. There were twice as many books, and a system of organization for those books that had been the subject of a discussion lasting most of an afternoon and resolving in a compromise that satisfied neither of them entirely and both of them completely, which Mara had identified as the signature of a genuinely good solution to almost any problem. There was a second coffee cup that was not a guest cup, but a regular cup, the specific cup of someone who had their own relationship with their own morning, and who shared that morning, unhurried and without performance, with another person who was also having their own morning, alongside theirs. Kalen was at the window when she came downstairs with the books, looking out at the snow with that quality of attention she had spent 3 years learning to read, the quality that meant he was not looking at the forest, but at something in the forest, something in the specific movement of wind and shadow, and the way the trees distributed themselves in relation to the old boundary line. "Someone's coming," she said. Not a question. Varen, and 2 others I don't know yet. He turned from the window. New representation from the Southern Territories. The formal session is in 3 days. I know. She set the books on her desk and looked at him. 3 years, and the quality of looking at him still did that thing to her sternum, still registered as something that she did not have a word for that was adequate, a feeling like standing at the edge of something very large and being glad to be there rather than afraid. "Coffee first." "Coffee first," he agreed. She made 2 cups. She brought them to the window where he stood. They looked out together at the morning, and the snow and the approaching figures at the tree line and the long shared territory of everything they had learned about each other in a winter of cold and fire, and words said to something she thought could not answer. And if you asked Mara Voss what had changed in 3 years, she would tell you a great many specific things, the legal framework and the territorial reform and the work still left to do. But underneath all of those specific things, underneath all of the careful architecture of a better world being built patiently out of old law and new attention, she would tell you this, that she had gone north to learn how to be seen, and she had found, in the most unexpected form and in the most impossible circumstance, someone who had already been watching, who had already understood, who had known her from the inside of her loneliness and stayed anyway, and that this specific and unrepeatable fact was the largest thing in any world she could imagine, larger than authority, and older than law, and warmer than any fire she had ever built in any winter. Outside, the snow was beginning to show the particular quality it has at the end of winter, when the light is changing and the cold is holding. But something underneath it has shifted, that quality of endurance, arriving at its conclusion, of long patience, becoming something else. Inside, 2 cups of coffee steamed on the windowsill, and a man who was old enough to remember the names of things that no longer existed stood beside a woman who had gone looking for silence and found something that turned out to be better. And the world was, in all its complicated and ongoing and imperfect becoming, entirely worth it. And that, friends, is where we leave them, not at the end of something, but in the middle of a life that is still going, still growing, still accumulating the particular depth that comes not from dramatic moments alone, but from the accumulation of ordinary ones. The 2 cups, and the shared window, and the books with their organization system, and the session still ahead, and the Southern Territories, and all the long, patient work of making things better than you found them. If this story moved you, if it gave you something, please leave a like because it genuinely helps this channel more than you might realize, and it lets me know that these stories are reaching the people they're meant for. Tell me in the comments, what moment was yours? Was it the porch in the snowstorm? Was it the fire in February? Was it the table and the primordial law? Was it just now, the 2 cups on the windowsill? I read every comment and I remember them and they matter. Subscribe if you haven't, because there are more stories coming and some of them are going to do things to you that this one didn't even think to attempt. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Go take care of yourselves the way Mara took care of something she didn't have to, which is to say, all the way, without knowing what it would become, because that's always how the real things start.